Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. What I have here is the latest video from a content creator, YouTuber, Twitch streamer named JSH. I've loved his work. I've referred to it before. I believe I've made entire videos off of some of the stuff he's talked about before. But this video jumped out at me as being very insightful when it comes to understanding EVE Online and maybe some of the kind of conflicts and understanding that we sometimes have between player base and designers and different members of the player base and our expectations of EVE Online. So this game is about, so we're going to watch this video and react to it. I'll pause it, and we'll use this as an opportunity to as a launching off point for discussion. All right. So, and by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, this will be in the links down below. Please, JSH is an amazing video creator. Several of his videos, I feel, communicated a lot of stuff about EVE Online and other, the game design as a concept, especially his one on sandboxes versus theme parks. Helped me think about the whole problem a little bit better. He's got a way of like taking the thing that we all know and talk about and actually say what it is. And that's what I like about it. So make sure to go follow him and all that stuff. But let's jump into it.
MMORPG games have a ton of content, from epic quests where you help others to life skills where you can relax and forge your own little existence, dungeons and raids rewarding powerful weapons and armour, or hidden areas where the only reward is the warm fuzzy feeling you get for finding a secret. The content you personally enjoy will help guide the game you play. There's no perfect design, but the idea of progression on a journey is universal across most RPG games. You adventure, you experience, and you grow, and within that progression there are two primary schools of design: vertical progression and horizontal progression. So let's...
Okay, so that presents the question that we are going to be trying to answer here, at least at the beginning, which is, which kind of progression does EVE Online have or focus on? Okay? What is EVE Online of these two?
Let's discuss what they are, the strengths and weaknesses of both, and the type of player that each appeal to. Quick note, this video is sponsored by Guild Wars 2, which is super convenient for me because I was going to use them as an example anyway. Welcome, I'm JSH. I've played a lot of MMORPGs, and while each is magically different in its own unique way, they all broadly appeal to one of two demographics: people who like vertical progression and people who like horizontal progression. But what do these terms mean? Imagine a vertical line with increasing numbers marked on it, let's say from 1 to 10. This line represents power, with 1 being weak and 10 being strong. We can take anything from the game, any weapon or piece of armor or equipment, and place it somewhere on this scale. A bronze dagger in RuneScape may be a 1, an abyssal whip may be a 7. Ultimately, everything can be ranked. Vertical progression is the design of things at the top being the most desirable and things lower down simply being stepping stones used to reach the things at the top. You will go through.
So there seems to be an element of this in EVE Online, obviously, right? Because you can unlock, stronger things. You can accumulate more ISK. You can, and with more ISK, you can bling out your ships better or get blingier ships. So there definitely is like a sense of progression. We'll keep watching.
Through the numbers from lower to higher, ultimately wanting to get to and remain at the highest number. If an MMORPG is a vertical progression...
So that's the thing. There is no highest number, right? So that's That's the first clue.
Game, this table ends up being taller than it is wide. The aim is to climb and stay there. This appeals to people who want the best stuff. It appeals to people who value power over the experience. Horizontal progression is slightly different. It's not that horizontal games don't have the vertical scale, it's that they spread wider than they go tall. You may have multiple items.
Okay, so a horizontal progression can have verticality.
Items of the same general strength, but they're achieved in different ways. They may be situational instead of objectively better. The scope of experience in the game is usually...
So, okay, different things of relatively the same power, less about scales of power, more about versatility. So let's look at that. We have the ship tree, right? So if we open up our ship tree, we see that, I mean, it's literally horizontal progression, right? Like, there is verticality, but if you notice, the idea is that most of these are not stronger than one another. They're fundamentally different. And if you think about it, it's even built into the design of the entire like tech tree, right? Because tech 1 is versatile, tech 2 is specialized. So there's a baked in, you know, cost benefit to a lot of this progression. It's mostly about having more options and being able to do more and different things rather than continually upgrading your ship into the one thing you do. Ha, do. All right.
Broader and older content remains relevant a lot longer at the expense of the power cap being generally lower. So let's look at some examples and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of both designs, and then maybe you'll discover which design you are most attracted to. I'm going to cover 7 main aspects of the design debate. 1. Chasing power versus...
Okay, so I think that from there we can say that Eve, between the two, I would argue that it is a wide design, right? If you think about it, wide designs have a lot of things to do, but still can have verticality. But the issue is that whenever I hear about, especially the angst that we've been hearing about EVE Online, it usually is arguments from verticality. We have enough verticality that people are looking at things exclusively from that regard. So we're going to look at like some of the differences between the two, and we're going to see where both sides problems crop up, and also the unique mixture that Eve has a tendency to mitigate some of the other problems.
Is the process itself. 2. The viability of older content. 3. Balancing the power standards. 4. Power creep versus feature creep. 5. Stat or feature squishing. 6. The ability to take a break and then return to the game. And 7. The personal drive of social power or personal enjoyment. But before we analyse these 7 points, a big thank you to Guild Wars 2 for agreeing to sponsor this video. I've played Guild Wars 2 since it launched all the way back in 2012, and it's been one of the few MMOs I've installed on every PC I've had since then, and finally, after like 5 years of coming soon, it's actually released on Steam. They've even released 2 very positive reviews. The latest expansion, End of Dragons, brings a ton of new content without invalidating the previous expansions Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire, but you don't need to buy anything to try the game. There is a massive...
I do appreciate that in the video about horizontal versus vertical progression, directly after he referred to how vertical progression invalidates previous progression, he specifically points out that the game that he is talking about here does not invalidate the previous content. I found that kind of an interesting thing to pull out.
free trial. The base game is free with no time limit, and if you do like it, it is a one-time purchase with no monthly sub. Once you own Guild Wars 2, you own it. And given the amount of hours I've got out of this game, Guild Wars 2 is probably the best value money I've ever spent on a video game. To celebrate the Steam launch, there's a link in the description. You can sign up, get a code, and grab the game on Steam, and then if you want, you can redeem the code for an experience boost pack, some karma boosting, and a 10-slot bag with a mini pet. This all saves you about $10, and it's free, so there's no reason not to. There's a new player guide on the website, although the in-game tutorial is actually really good. There's great build variety in the classes, and the mount system is so good it is now the standard by which other games are to be judged. Now, regular viewers will know that I don't accept sponsorships unless I can personally vouch for the product, and honestly, Guild Wars 2 is just a really good MMORPG game with a great deal of content that every player should at least try. But to sweeten the deal even more, one lucky user who uses this code will get the $100 pack on Steam, including all the Guild Wars 2 content, absolutely free. Check the video description for more details. Right, back to vertical versus horizontal design. Let's start with the basics. The most simple...
In case you guys need it, I linked the code in chat and I guess down below. What's up, Combat Bunny? We are going over Josh Hayes' video on horizontal versus vertical design. We've just kind of started to get into it.
Appeal of vertical design is the chasing of power. The best item, the best armor, the best spell. The numbers are simply higher. You can compare and contrast every item in the game and see at a glance, objectively, which is a better choice.
So this was one of the very first things that made me realize that I wanted to react about this. Because again, this dissonance of the way that the players see things and the way that the game is developed and built, is the discordance between that is something that has been frustrating me for some time. So this really slid into place a big piece of what was going on, right? So these guys that are complaining that their Titans were nerfed and that their Titans should be good because they paid so much for it, or because they got it, or slot in rock walls or whatever. What we're really hearing is an evaluation from a vertical point of view. I have walked the path. I am beyond the things below it, and now I have earned the right to have the best thing, right? But Eve itself is not about necessarily the best thing, right? So one of the questions that I have that I think we might actually be able to answer here is why does that happen? Right? Why do people take on this new idea, or this relatively new idea, of the idea that Eve is a race to an end game, and then you're at the end game? Because that is not the way it has been always. This is a relatively new phenomena that people have kind of stopped resisting that concept.
Sword doing 1 damage compared to a sword doing 10 damage. Higher number, better. This can lead to game design where a single choice is objectively correct for the majority of gaming situations, and that choice has no variations within itself. If there is a best weapon in the game, everyone wants to get it and use it. That is the power you chase. For vertical players, the actual experience of getting the power comes second to having the power itself. They value the reward over the process. In horizontal progression...
However, what's interesting here is that you can look at the game from a second perspective. And from this perspective, it starts to make sense, which is the meta perspective, right? In the same way that ISK is not power in Eve, right? Because if I have 5 million ISK versus 30 million ISK, sure, I'm way more powerful. If I have 300 million ISK, I'm probably way more powerful. If I have 3 billion ISK, I'm definitely more powerful, but now I'm basically able to just refit the powerful stuff more often. I can deal with more loss or whatever. By the time I get up to like 500 billion ISK, more ISK is not giving me more raw power. It might be giving me more sustain, but honestly, it allows me to, it enables me to have my options, right? So I want to accumulate ISK as power, not because it gives me like more powerful swords, but rather it makes me more powerful in the meta game. Sorry, I think that the important thing here is that this scales up to organizations too. And that's where you really start to see it, because an organization is a meta construct, right? So this is one of those reasons why maybe games with a thing like nullsec naturally collapse towards one powerful group, because in the end, the desire to be the strongest over time is relegated to be part of this team or not be the strongest.
It's less about the power and more about variation and experience. The process is now more important than the reward, because the reward isn't specifically any more powerful than what you already have. Imagine you have a weapon which does X amount of damage, and there's another weapon in the game which also does X damage but now looks different or is achieved in a more difficult way. A good example would be the ornamental kits in old school RuneScape or RuneScape 3. They make the weapon look different visually, but they act identical mechanically. You won't gain any extra power from having the weapon itself, but you will have the experience of getting it.
So that is another interesting point. Hold on.
Focus is on variations, not greater items. But
Eve kind of takes this and puts a spin on it, right? In other, we can look at that last statement. You know, I get a different weapon that is not more powerful, but maybe a different option. What we could actually rephrase that as saying that they are functionally fungible, right? It doesn't actually matter which sword I have, except for, like, to me. So in that regard, ISK is the ultimate version of that. We don't do the activities that we do for the reward of that activity, right? This is minerals you mine yourself aren't free. We always consider, because of the fact that this is an open market game and everything can be bought and sold, your product isn't, you don't have to go do a specific thing to get a specific thing, which naturally funnels us towards more efficient processes over a variety of processes or something along those lines, right? Regardless of whether or not, you know, in the argument of, you know, ISK per hour, fun per hour, whatever, the big difference is you're still deciding what you do and do that one thing. We don't have the thing where in places like Final Fantasy 14 or whatever, where in a day, if you actually want to do content for more than a couple of hours, you're probably going to have to do a variety of things. You're going to quickly run out of your ability to do that thing because everything's kind of limited in how much you can make a little bit of progress in everything each day. And then it becomes less efficient in pretty significant ways, right? It encourages you to do a variety of activities every single time. Eve encourages a variety of activities because the passivity of many of the processes means that you can keep plates spinning and therefore have multiple income streams. But it's not like you're doing any given specific thing for its specific reward. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good or bad thing. Volatile skins was a terrible idea, at least in the way that they did them. But I do think that unique rewards, there's a place in the game for unique rewards for doing specific things. For instance, titles or stuff that you can only get by doing specific achievements or whatever. Proving ground skins is a good example of that.
How does this affect the game when you've got everything and new content has to be added? With vertical design focusing on the reward and horizontal focusing on the process, the risk for vertical comes in the form of Once a player has the power, why would they go through any process?
The problem with both, hey, thank you. The real problem with both of those solutions, metals and the abyssal skins, is that while they both are things to collect, we're actually talking about two different things here. Because what I'm talking about is an activity, a kind of grinding. I know that that sounds bad, but like ultimately these are paths that are being walked, right? So tying it to a certain amount of activity in faction warfare, or a certain achievement, or maybe a rare site that can only be found, very rarely as a data site or whatever. Like those would be the kind of things that I'm talking about, things that you can, work towards, as opposed to tokens of victory. Does that make sense?
Process when they know it would reward a less powerful item. If your player base values being the most powerful, and they are the most powerful, other content loses its appeal. This is a major problem with vertical design. It invalidates old content extremely quickly.
So this is how we know that deep down inside, the development of Eve isn't, like the design of Eve at least, is not overly vertical. If you built an Armageddon 15 years ago, it is still as relevant, maybe not as relevant, but still a powerful force, right? It's not a relic of a bygone era that can be crushed by the nearest frigate that has come out in the latest expansion, right? But it may be fundamentally different than it once was, but it'll still be a relevant thing and likely worth the same amount, roughly, relationally, to what it was before.
If a dungeon drops a weapon or armor set, and then a new dungeon drops a better one, the old dungeon simply becomes a stepping stone to the higher one, but then forgotten about once the higher one is achieved.
But wait, we do have this problem. But we have it in the content itself. When we're talking about this, think about it this way. It's the meta progression, right? The problem here is that a new bro, based on new skills, can only do low-tier activities. Low-tier activities don't reward as well. But since you vertically progress on a meta scale, that means getting past that is the goal. That results in two things. One, it results in that pressure for buying skill injectors, all of this angst about that kind of thing, and more importantly, the frustration of needing to skill really is driven home by that, right? And these accusations that CCP is intentionally trying to sell skill injectors by making changes or whatever, right? But the other problem is that what that means is all of that other content is considered worthless by the community. The thing is that a new bro doesn't need a fabulous amount of ISK. A new bro doesn't even need to actually have an Omega account. A new bro needs to learn how to fly and how the game works. Okay? Doing easy content with cheaper equipment is the thing that they should be doing. And if they have a good mentor, yeah, the air career program has actually come a long ways. Maybe I'll jump back into that. But if they have a good mentor, then they could use that to quickly, get on their feet and progress and move on. But when we explain to people, when we set the standard of what a high skill point person can attain as far as ISK per hour or whatever, like that's where a lot of this pressure comes from. And what I always wonder is, how much have we do we cheapen the experience when we do that? And do we risk, like, by doing so, do we risk that new bro not being able to fully appreciate what is there or gain their own sense of mastery? But either way, back to the career agent, the air career agent. This is all of that's why I really like the air career agents and where they're going with it. And the symptom of that is actually, and one of them is in chat right now, I believe. But now all of the names are falling out of my head. There's been a couple of new bros recently that I've been watching. And Combat Bunny, I believe. Yes. These guys that are playing the game, what I'm seeing is new bros with objectives. I'm seeing them open up the air career agent thing to look for things to do. I literally heard a new bro like complimenting the new player experience, and another new bro complimenting the UI. I was in chat with CCP Swift, and some new bro was like, "Man, this UI is actually really great." And I was like, "Yeah, you know, Swift, how everybody always talks about how great the Eve UI is."
Vertical progression attracts players who want to climb up, and everything lower than where they are is seen as pointless. New content doesn't become more of the game, it sometimes becomes the only part of the game worth doing.
So this is actually the real problem. This is where all of the problems that we've been talking about, or all the pieces that we've just been talking about, collide, right? When everything is worth ISK, if everything breaks down to its value in ISK, then all content that CCP introduces for all levels will be evaluated upon all of the other options that already exist. That is one of the biggest design puzzles that they find themselves in. This is one of the reasons why it's difficult for some of these new features. But that's why we see a lot of cynicism when it comes to events or other things that are coming out, right? Because ultimately they can quickly look at it, see that it doesn't provide anything for them, or it's not got the bigger number, and therefore write it off. That's a concern.
Ironically, an expansion doesn't actually expand a game if it becomes the only part of the game worth focusing on. Now, horizontal design often links together older content with newer content because the focus isn't on outclassing, but supporting. This isn't to say the rewards for new content aren't more powerful. They can be, but they are never completely eclipsed by new things, or the time taken to advance on the vertical ladder is still great enough that old content is still worth doing.
Don't worry, Valamir. You'd probably find their content not really valuable either. No, I'm just kidding. So, again, like the thing is here that when we look at content as different ships to fly, this is 100% true. When we look at content as things to do, it becomes a little bit more questionable.
Consider a new expansion in World of Warcraft. When something new comes out, the older content and the older expansions are often outclassed in terms of power. The best items from 10 years ago are superseded by average items from now. But for an excellent example of horizontal design in content, look at the Barrows armor in old school RuneScape. The Barrows minigame released in 2005 and the rewards from it remained relevant for years. Indeed, old school RuneScape itself released in 2013 and the Barrows minigame is still a vital part of a new player journey. Despite many similar rewards now existing, it's not been overshadowed. When an MMORPG receives new high-level content, vertical MMOs often watch older content become irrelevant because the power level has risen, and horizontal MMOs watch older content become another piece in a greater puzzle as the variation increases. But both of these can lead to issues.
So this is actually one of the things that has always like attracted me to Eve, and is one of the things that always is kind of lauded as a big strength of Eve, especially back when we had regular expansions, which thankfully we're getting back to. But like a WoW expansion is about the new, like, this is what the new graphics looks like. These are the new monsters. This is the new dungeons. But if you think about it, you always have the current content, the content that's one step behind the content, which is your leveling or your gearing content or whatever, and then everything else. And things quickly fall off into what I call the museum, right? Because you go through those dungeons simply to be like, oh yeah, and over here we used to do this, you know. And obviously that isn't the way things happen in Eve. But at the same time, we actually run into an issue between the way that Eve does it and the way that he describes it here, which is that Eve features often don't always interconnect in the same way that you would expect. Often these are independent of each other, which, I mean, it is what it is. The other thing is that we'll talk about this later.
With point 3, power creep versus feature creep. If your game is vertical, players want more power. If your game is horizontal, players want more choice. Adding power is simple. Increase a number, weapon do more damage, armor stop more damage. Even releasing a new class or race like Neverwinter did with the Metallic Dragonborn and just straight up giving them better passive buffs. Adding more power patch by patch is super simple, but it leads to the inevitable endgame of power creep. When everyone is godlike, no one is.
So one of the arguments I've been hearing recently is like, well, why doesn't CCP come out with T2 capitals? Why doesn't CCP come out with more faction capitals? Why doesn't CCP come out with a T2 Titan? Whatever. This is why. Because all you're asking for is just another race that you'll race up to the top, and then you'll be at the top again. And then you want more, and then you want more. And the problem is that what's really happening is we're stretching the path and further and further if you're looking at it as a path, or the gulf further and further if you're looking at it as horizontal. If these things are supposed to be interacting with each other, the further the distance and verticality they are, the less likely that's going to work out well.
Power is only powerful when compared to something less so, and when everyone is hitting millions of damage, the number itself isn't considered large, that's just normal. A player who wants to be considered powerful must be compared against a player of lesser power. So by increasing the power cap every update, you're adding small but constant windows of gameplay where the players race to achieve the increase in power and enjoy being more powerful for a short time before inevitably everyone catches up. So you increase it again, and you repeat this forever. Horizontal progression, however, may avoid that absurd degree of power creep, but it still faces the equally complex issue of feature creep. If a new update in a horizontal game can't simply make a number bigger, it needs to change something mechanically, adding a new choice, a new situational effect, a new experience for the player, a weapon which has elemental damage or does more damage at nighttime, or armor which works better when you stand still. If you can't just make a number go up, you have to make the gameplay experience change. And while this is great in the short term, it can lead to a massive amount of intricate features being added which are overwhelming when a new player joins and has to understand all of them in one go. Feature creep can sometimes even be more insidious because the enfranchised player base doesn't realize how complex.
That's actually a really big thing that we've heard already. Like this has been a big theme of ours, right? For Eve. CCP was talking about this during some of their later presentation. I don't remember exactly when they were talking about it the most, but the issue is that compared to 20 years ago, this game is so much, there's so much more to learn, right? That the barrier to entry to understanding is so much greater than it ever, like what it takes to be good. It was harsher back then, but what you were expected to know was a much smaller quantity of things.
Can sometimes even be more insidious because the enfranchised player base doesn't realize how complex their game has become as they've adapted to each feature change slowly. It doesn't.
And that right there is my YouTube channel in a sentence, right? Like, yeah, that's the problem, is that our experienced players don't think about the game in the framework of a player that is learning it. And this, they don't remember what it took for them to learn.
Feel much more different because things were added one at a time. But then a new player joins and they're told
Also
about
that.
many systems added slowly over many years, and they're expected to understand how they all link together.
The other problem here, though, with Eve is that because they're not linked always together, and because ISK allows you to kind of abstract anything that you don't want to deal with, what this means is that experienced players actually resist learning about new things. So they actually just continue to live in their mastered niche. Newer players end up knowing more about the newer stuff than experienced players do. And then when the experienced player stuff gets disrupted, they feel like there's nothing left to do.
Together. Sometimes these negatives can actually combine and you end up with an MMORPG adding updates or content which both increases the power level substantially enough to invalidate old content and add new complex systems which are overwhelming for new or returning players. These types of updates are often met with major backlash from the player base and result in people leaving. For a great example, see the evolution of combat for RuneScape back in the day. But this leads
So one of the things, hold on.
on to point 4.
Oh, yeah. But here's the thing, though. EVE Online, my question is, has EVE Online had a stat squish or a feature squish? It's been around for 20 years. You'd think that if either of these two problems happened, we would see symptoms of it. So given the fact that it's mostly wide, the thing is that we haven't really seen that much feature squish in EVE, right? With a few exceptions, we don't see systems being removed from the game. But that got me thinking, this is one of the reasons that why I realized that there's a way to you evaluate this both as a individual game design point of view and also from a meta perspective. Because while that's true about the things you can do and the powers within ships and all that stuff, it only gets more and more and more. The roles can get removed. What my friend who quit the game because the idea of like the all day long roll call booster foreman for his mining corp was taken away when off-grid boosting was taken away. Like that was a feature. That was a feature squish. It was a feature being removed. Like, but a feature as in that play style. So it exists in that sense, but it is still pretty rare. And so I kept chewing on this, and it's like, why? How does EVE Online resist that? And I think that the real reason why is because CCP aggressively cannibalizes their content for the new content. We don't get a new ship that fits a new option. They take an old ship that's not working, rip it apart, and stuff the new stuff in, right? Simultaneously cutting back away from something that isn't working and adding something that is. And so given the fact that CCP continually cannibalizes things, they don't just add a feature, they redo the feature or whatever, or at least continue to tweak it or whatever. Like, my point is that they avoid having to have a big change where they have to like rip out a whole chunk because they make it as a change as opposed to a removal. Does that make sense? But on the other hand, I realized that a stat squish has actually happened in EVE Online not too long ago. Think about it. What is a stat squish? A stat squish is when the numbers when everybody's trying to get their numbers higher, we change the scale on which the numbers are measured that compresses it, bringing the bottom and the top closer together. That's effectively what you're actually doing. Scarcity was EVE Online's stat squish. Prove me wrong.
Developers must know that power creep or feature creep exists, and they must realise the issue. So why do they do either one? Well, it's because the player base that that game is aiming at actually values the advantage they can gain from...
Scarcity was... So basically in around 2020, really starting in 2019, CCP transitioned how they did things. Before that, we kind of escalated up to the point where now people are building Titans pretty regularly. People had been given the tools to amass massive amounts of wealth. And so through a course of some pretty aggressive changes and other meddling, CCP made it so that a lot of things were more expensive, tried to drain coffers, tried to add complexity into systems that were too simple, or, you know, add more degrees of decision making in places. And in the end, it ripped apart a lot of things. It hurt a lot of people because your progress got squished. But unlike a game like World of Warcraft, where you can kind of see that and externalize it and conceptualize it, because we're so emotionally invested in our power level in EVE, watching that get impacted is bad. Yeah, in a lot of ways, scarcity was good for new bros or other people that were willing to take advantage of it. It was very bad for the most established, easier, I guess, options for wealth generation in the game.
Being the player to exploit that change. Players who enjoy games with power creep often enjoy the power creep because it's a measure.
Eve got harder. No, what they did was like, so a good example is the industry changes. T1 is dirt simple when it comes to industry. It's take minerals, take blueprint, smash them together, thing pops out, right? T2 industry is fabulously complicated. You have to invent the BPC. You have to have the correct data cores, which are based on which each individual item. Each individual item also has usually 2 or more different products that are pulled from different moons. These moons can be, but not always, are from different areas of space. So all this stuff needs to get brought in. Reactions need to be done. You know, formulas have to be made. Then that invented blueprint has to be used with an original Tech 1 to build the Tech 2 with the extra bonus stuff. It's a huge jump. So what they did was they took the easier version of that reactions chain and they put it on battleships and faction stuff. So now there's kind of they didn't make the entire game harder, but they took a chunk of the easy part and made it a little bit harder, so that way it functions as a stepping stone for the actual more complicated stuff.
Measurable way to be more powerful than someone else. This is especially prevalent in PvP games or on PvP servers.
So this is really, really the section where you have to think about this in the terms of an alliance, not just an individual. Because if you think about it, that is actually how we acquire power past the extent of our skills and ISK and ship, right? Like at a certain point, the accumulation of power is the accumulation of a powerful alliance, not powerful gear.
Where creating a power imbalance in your favor is literally part of the experience. You can have a better weapon or a better set of armor, and you can use that power to defeat someone else. The imbalance is by design, and new players will struggle to beat old players because the maths simply doesn't allow it.
Boom. And that is one of the reasons why newer players say that they can't catch up, right? Because even though we all know that, you know, a new player can actually become just as effective as an experienced player in any given thing pretty easily, they look at the massive web of connections and power that has been assembled by these established groups and see that as something that's it's not that I'm never going to have a good enough ship to fight that fight. It's that I'm never going to beat that guy pointing at the mountain.
A vertical progression game encourages players to climb the ladder by letting them compete with players higher up on it and losing, or compete with players lower down and winning. That's the revenge. This may be in direct PvP or by playing with more powerful players, seeing them and thinking, I want to be that. If power creep is designed to encourage that competitive mentality by making power so easy to measure, what does horizontal progression do? Well, if it's PvP, it often focuses on the balancing of the experience, balancing the playing field. Now, regardless of the sponsorship, I would have still used Guild Wars 2 for this example. Having the missed PvP arena which levels everyone to max, gives everyone equal equipment and lets you compete in a fair fight. But
real quick, a new player can never catch up to a 20-year-old vet in SPS. But the thing is that if you come and do faction warfare and you hop into a Tristan, you can be just as good as I am in that Tristan within like a month or two.
But there are issues with this too. You're directly removing one of the core aspects of the RPG. The progress, and now you're competing on the PvP scene against larger, more established games who specialize entirely in PvP. Ultimately,
every major organization takes and appreciates new bros, most of them have, like the bigger ones have their own new bro cultivating organizations. They have a varying degree of quality, I guess I'd say, but the point is that everybody's important. If all you can do is fly a frigate, that means that you can fly tackle. And that means that your little, I just joined the game 2 days ago, could somehow end up being the reason why this 300-man fleet was able to beat this 300-man fleet. Like, and that's, the thing is that may sound like a high level thing, but like, that is actually super reasonable. I've taken a fleet of brand new bros and changed the course of a major fight simply because we showed up with a whole bunch of tracking disruption and we're able to like keep all the Macarials from being able to hit things long enough for our Macarials to kill them, right? Like there are ways for you to impact the battlefield in some really big ways, but also the amount of skills that can apply to any given ship configuration is relatively minimal. Right? Like once you've trained your weapon system and its support skills, your tank, and train that race's ship for that thing, or, train the ship skills, you're going to run pretty quickly out of things that will make that particular ship better. Now you have to train something that'll make other ships better. You get what I'm saying? It's about accumulation of options.
Both of these approaches, adding increasing power or adding increasing features, serve to deepen the divide between the player base from the start and finish of the game, and this often ends up needing a stat squish or feature reset to fix, which leads to point 5. When the game simply becomes too vertical or too horizontal, and the gap between players too great, the game has to be brought back to a manageable size for the player base to actually play together.
Did I rewind or skip ahead?
Resets can be complex in different ways. A power-based stat squish mostly just involves reducing the numbers, which never feels good because players feel like you're taking earned power away from them, but can sometimes be justified for the longevity of the game. And while I'm not a fan of the process of removing anything, I can understand the long-term goal they're going for. Like how Neverwinter briefly had damage numbers in the tens of millions and had to reduce all numbers by a factor of several hundred before we ended up hitting trillions. A vertical power-based game has an unusual relationship with stat squishes. They will be needed more frequently, but because they're just reducing the numbers behind the scenes, they're actually very easy to do. Horizontal progress games, however, have a much harder time resetting to a manageable size because the game grows not in numbers, but in features. And a stat squish would be more of a feature squish, removing excess mechanics or talents or skills. And this can
Valamir points out that he's been through a stat squish in both WoW and Final Fantasy, and it never felt less powerful. And that's true, but think about it this way. In both of those games, how much warning the developers give, and how much anxiety was it clear that the developers had about the player base misinterpreting it, right? Because it is 100% of a psychological thing. That's why I said, like, scarcity feels so bad because it's a context issue more than anything else. It has to do with your relationship with your power, your expectations about your power, and how well everything is communicated to you. You were given the opportunity to fully understand the scope of A, what was happening, and B, why it was necessary.
Can involve changing the fundamental way in which certain playstyles will work.
Even if you didn't agree.
Neverwinter is again a good example. When Lifesteal, a stat which restored your own health by a portion of the damage you do, was removed, an entire style of tanking was removed from the game with it, and squishy players who relied on aggressive gameplay to survive were now useless. They were just squishy and dead.
That's what made me think of my Rockwall friend.
Feature squish and the removal of lifesteal actually made the game slower and the combat less intense, which was something Neverwinter had pushed away from for many, many years. Resetting vertical power creep feels bad, but is relatively simple. Resetting horizontal feature creep is much more challenging because features are tied to the moment-to-moment gameplay. But let's imagine a major reset does happen and you decide to take a break from the game, because no one likes to lose high numbers or skills they've come to enjoy. This brings up point 6. Taking a break and returning feels very different for both types of design. We've all had that horrible feeling of returning to an RPG after a long time and thinking, what the hell was I even doing? I once returned to Chrono Trigger after a few months away, and after staring at the screen for a minute, I decided to just restart the whole game. Returning to an MMO is a daunting task, and the vertical-horizontal divide heavily changes that experience. Returning to a vertical game feels like starting again anyway. Your items and equipment are often useless and outclassed, and the content you knew is not being run anymore. The player base have all moved on to the latest area, so you're left fighting back up the ladder, doing content no one else is doing because it's just a step you need, but they are past it. Vertical games are often called treadmill games. If you stop running, you fall off, and then you need to catch up. Your friends and guild will shoot off ahead. But there is one good side to this, a silver lining to this cloud. You've got a pretty good idea of what you need to be aiming for. You just head to whatever the highest number is or the newest expansion is. The beauty of having an objectively best choice is you can just make that choice.
So this is actually an important thing, because this does a couple of things. One, this is the reason why somebody who bounces off the game early and then comes back thinks that they might as well start over, even though the SP that they've trained is already useful in progress. It's also so. Hold on. What was it?
Need to be aiming for. You just head to whatever the.
I cannot explain how useful this is when it comes to actually retaining those returning players, right? If the person, any opportunity to bounce off a person in their early steps is very impactful, right? You want to draw them in as quickly as possible. This is true when you're first trying out the game, but it's also true when the person is returning, because they're the least invested in it at that point, right? So if anything gets in their way, then they may just be like, never mind, right? If they log in and see something and be like, I can't understand this, there's a decent chance that they'll just close it and be like, never mind, I'll come back this later. So the idea of that's one of the reasons why the air program is really good, is because it cancels that as an returning player. But this is also one of the reasons why I've said that the tutorial should be a series of things that can be triggered as often and whenever you would like from the agency or aura or whatever. So that way a returning player can bounce into it. You could argue that events at least gives a returning player something to do, but the problem is that event design often is pretty brutal, pretty demanding, pretty restrictive. So if you're a newer player or a returning player that don't have your wits about you, they're actually a bad thing to go charging into. And to make matters worse, not only are there all these new things that you don't know anything about or even know what's there. Those things could definitely kill you, potentially, or whatever. Probably will kill you if you don't know about them and therefore do the wrong thing. On top of that, the part about the cannibalizing of previous things actually comes and bites us in the ass right now, because even the things that we relied on are now potentially completely different. So even the things I don't know what has been added, and I don't know what has been changed. What do you mean this ship is now a nuding ship? What? Right? Like, that actually ends up being a pretty nasty barrier to entry. On top of that, things have changed so much and so many times in EVE. If you just go onto Google and search for stuff, there is a reasonable chance that you will actually end up with the wrong information. And unfortunately, this is becoming increasingly a problem, even in places that are normally really good about this stuff, like EVE Uni and whatnot. Not saying that they, like, very, very rarely, but I mean, like, the point is that if you just, like, a person who doesn't know what they're doing doesn't know how to evaluate the up-to-date stuff or the true stuff from the old stuff, right? So that's not even really a good solution for them. So I have all this stuff. I don't know what to do with it. If I don't know what else is going on. I know that this stuff is pretty valuable, and I also know that if I make a mistake, I will regret it, and it'll be costly, and everybody will make fun of me, and I'll feel bad. I am going to play No Man's Sky, right? Like, can't we all see that happening? EVE Uni is great, by the way.
Highest number is or the newest expansion is. The beauty of having an objectively best choice is you can just make that choice. Returning to a horizontal game, however, is a bit different. Your equipment often retains its power, and your rare items retain their value because they've not been outclassed, they're now just a variation on something else. So the player base is still doing what you already know. They're just doing it in different ways.
Yeah, the advantage is that if you can get past that initial hurdle, you don't have to necessarily catch up. Everything you have is still valuable. And because it's valuable, even if you don't need that thing anymore, everything's fungible. You can sell it for ISK and then get a different thing, right? If they nerf capitals, you can just, if they nerf the thing that you love to do, when you come back and you need to do something different, you can just sell it and get something else. You might lose some value in it, but I mean, in World of Warcraft, you come back and it was 3 expansions old and it's literally worth nothing.
New systems you need to learn or old skills revamped to work in new ways. I get this feeling whenever I return to old school RuneScape. My skills haven't gone anywhere, my equipment is still useful, there's just new stuff to do in various directions. Returning to a horizontal progression game often feels easier because you feel that you've still got what you left, but now it's also harder to pick a direction because there's no objectively correct or best thing. It's often a case of, what do you want to do? And more often than not, you'll end up thinking, well, I don't know what's worth doing. And
so that's actually the problem from the beginning, right? Like, this is the problem that new bros come into and all that stuff. But there's actually one more piece to all of this, which is it's fine for us to brush off that you still have all your stuff and therefore you don't really lose anything. But as things like abandoned structures, Pochfin, Nullsec, and other places have taught us, like, the thing is that the deeper you are committed into one of these paths, the more, the harder it will be to step back into it, right? If you just had a bunch of missioning friends, then you could always just log back in and now you have your missioning ship and you're in high sec and you might need to, like, move to a different missioning hub. If you are part of a null block and you leave the game, there's a really good chance that you're going to come back with all of your stuff in asset safety and your alliance being on the other side of the cluster. If you live in Pochfin or in wormhole space, there's a reasonable chance if you leave stuff in a structure, you won't come back to it, right? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, the problem is that so much of what we do on the high end, so much of the high end gameplay is not because it's hard to execute or even takes that much expensive equipment. It's more about the Rube Goldberg machine that it takes to actually make the task possible, right? So now that I've gone through all of the effort of getting all the ships in place and I've done all the work that allows me to do the stuff, Well, that's the thing that can get pretty easily reset. Because everything's ephemeral and it burns.
All of this ultimately leads on to the final point. Vertical progression is focused on the satisfaction of the reward over the process. It values becoming powerful in a way others can see and then respect. It often leads to objectively correct choices in gameplay loops and character builds, whereas horizontal progression is more about enjoying the process than the reward itself.
So, again, this is actually my problem, right? So, in Final Fantasy XIV, they have the Island Sanctuary. The Island Sanctuary provides almost no good rewards. Like, it is literally an outfit and one of the most inefficient ways of getting a resource that you can get in other ways, right? Like, objectively, it would be panned in EVE Online. But it's because, like, it is the act of having that place and going through that experience that is the whole point of it and why it is a very popular feature. We lose that. We have lost that in EVE for various reasons. And I think that ends up making us, it cheapens us out of as good of an experience as it could be. Because the problem is that a lot of the game is actually designed to be pretty compatible with that, right? With the, there's things to discover and, does that make sense? Like, there are things to do, but nothing has intrinsic value built into it beyond its ISK output, with the exception of like various different ways of putting your flag in the sand, right? Like being part of faction warfare, being part of null.
Becoming powerful in a way that's personally relevant to you, but not necessarily more socially powerful than
like I suggested before, what if they use standings to allow us to kind of get some texture to the different empires, especially the pirate ones? So what if you got like 8.0 with the Garistas, they would let you access their smuggler gate network, that you now actually get to see the beacons for these smuggler gates, which are effectively just another set of stable wormholes that rearrange themselves every day, and therefore now you have a random but useful way to get around that other people may not necessarily have.
Anyone else. Vertical games encourage the players to play by adding new things for the players to chase, the allure of power and the dominance over other players and over the game itself. In a vertical game, power is the driving force. The journey is simply a step on the route to power. Horizontal design adds content for the players to experience.
So here's the thing. When you have a vertical perspective on a non-vertical game, that's where this kind of breaks down, right? Because if you have a vertical progression, you're like, I want power, but the way I get it is by getting this item and this item and this item and this item, and I get this item here and this item here, and I have to do this here, and oh, I didn't get this one this time. You have to do different things. Given the fact that everything distills down to the one metric of power, that makes it so that like it kind of begins to collapse, right? It makes it so that we naturally narrow our focus and reject things that are not profitable.
And the value of the experience itself is the valuable thing, even if you have nothing to show for the experience beyond memories and enjoyment. The satisfaction of gaining power is replaced with the personal satisfaction of overcoming a gaming challenge. Here's an interesting example. In Guild Wars 1, you can...
So, to put it a different way, why aren't people learning the Abyss to be able to beat the Tier 6 Abyss? Because they want to be able to do it. why do we mostly hear about how good of an ISK it is, and they reluctantly go through the process of gaining the ISK or the whatever in order to do it, and they usually try to do it with cutting as many corners as possible, because the objective is that they want to be able to like milk it for ISK. There aren't that many players that take the most extreme things and then do it to do it. I'm not saying do it forever. What I'm saying is, why don't I hear very many people take up the objective of, I am going to learn the Abyss with the objective of getting to be able to do tier 6 Abyss. I could just never do it again after that, but now I have that option. It's unlocked to me, and I can do it. It's not worth doing. Do you know how much you'll learn in that process? Like, the thing is that we're talking about a new player, and we're talking about one of the major issues is that they don't have a direction. That singular goal will cause them to learn so much about the game, achieving it, that whenever they do achieve it, they've pretty much opened up the oyster for themselves, right? They have a really good way of making ISK. They understand a lot about flight mechanics. They know a lot about E-War and other pieces like that. Yeah, I seriously believe that it's because we do require like a little trophy. We need a little doodad that says, yep, you did it. Good job. Even though we want to do it and feel awesome, if the game itself doesn't call it out, we feel it's being cheapened. That's my theory.
Actually use the bonus input to just get given some of the best weapons in the game from the very start.
That being said, I will say that the people that I see this out of the most, the people that are like, I've set this goal for myself and I'm doing it, are newer players. And the problem that I run into is when that person runs into an experienced player, often that experienced player's advice that they come to the experienced player to get is, stop doing that thing that you're doing. It's not worth doing. Here's the simple thing. Go hit nails with a hammer.
You can use them immediately. So you'd be thinking, why am I playing the game? There's very little I can get that's better than what's been given to me. But
it's not a singular experience, actually. I've set several small groups. Whenever I run into like 2 or 3 guys that are all, or people, I guess, trying out Eve for the first time, I teach them about Frigate Abyss. Frigate Abyss is a great way for newer players to play together, use the fact that they're working with each other as a strength, and then by the time that they stop getting whacked in the Abyss over and over again. Hold on. Right, but once they can get to tier 2, that same group of people are very, very close to being able to go to hook bills and then jump up to tier 5. I also said that didn't have to be their goal. I was saying, why don't we hear that? And I was just using that as like the example. You can also say tier 5 is your goal. And my point is that I hear a lot of new bureaus having these kinds of things. They have smaller goals, but that gets them to seek out answers. But those answers tell them that their goals aren't worth doing. Oh, that's not profitable. That it's whatever. When they weren't learning, they weren't doing that task, they weren't building that ship, they weren't running the Abyss, that run of the Abyss necessarily in order to make their fortune. They were doing it to understand the industry system, or to, whatever. It's just a practical exercise. So yeah, I wish that the Abyss in particular was able to be used as the training mechanism it really can be, with the additional support. But yeah, it is unironically a really good way for newer players to learn how to fly as frigates or destroyers. Oh yeah, the guys who can do tier 2. Maybe I miscommunicated. The group of 3 people who can consistently do tier 2s can likely jump up to tier 4, tier 5 and hook bills, right? If you can run tier 2s, really tier 2 is actually almost too hard. You run tier 1s with like triple kestrels in a dark until you never make any mistakes. And then maybe you see if you can, like, you might lose a few trying to do the tier 2, but as long as you can do a tier 2, then you're usually ready to either step up to a hawk or step up to a like hook bills or whatever and just dunk it. How do I find new goals to keep playing Eve? What would you suggest to be a good way for a solo player to branch out from solo PvP junk? So it's getting better, and hopefully there's going to be more stuff coming with the expansion that's coming. But one of the ways that I do it, honestly, is if you go here into your personal, you can see your activity tracker, which doesn't have any data right now because I'm Singularity. But that has like all of the different kind of activities there are in the game and whatnot, and how much you've done them, and let you earn up points or you know, rank up or whatever in them. Heron Navy. So that's a good way to hunt for things. And then, of course, the air career track is a good way. But honestly, unironically, the best way to figure out what to do in Eve is to get out there and just start poking around. Like, something weird's going to happen. Something's going to lead to another. Just get out there and start doing stuff. Poke around, look at things.
While I was playing, I realised that's not the point of Guild Wars 1. The numbers are incredibly low and the items are relatively easy to get. You play for the enjoyment of the process of playing, not...
Okay, and this is the biggest problem. So that is actually a huge piece of all of this, right? Oh, you can't see it. Yep. Hold on. Let's listen to that again.
Am I playing the game? There's very little I can get that's better than what's been given to me. But while I was playing, I realised that's not the point of Guild Wars 1. The numbers are incredibly low and the items are relatively easy to get. You play for the enjoyment of the process of playing, not necessarily the gaining of power. So when...
Okay. So that pretty much brings a lot of this home, which is most players, new players that I see, sure, some of them have like seen some big fleet battle, and so they're trying to figure out how to get one of them Titans. But a lot of new players at their newest, I'm not talking about like week 2 when they're already frustrated, they've lost a ship or whatever. I'm talking about, I am having difficulty finishing this tutorial level good. These guys, a lot of them are here because they want to fly around in space. My friend who got me into Eve, all he does, even to this day, when I finally drag him back into Eve every once in a while, is he'll do like low-level missions with relatively like an Algos or something like that, whatever, because he just loves the idea of like warping his ship out, launching his drones, sitting back and sipping his coffee like a goddamn starship pilot while he watches it all play out. That's his enjoyment, man. I can't make him do anything else. It doesn't matter what kind of reward it has, right? Because that's what he's doing it for. That's what he's logging into Eve for. I know a lot of people who are in Eve for the cool shit in Eve, not for the power. So I just wish, because and then on the other hand, there's so much for those people to find and do and enjoy, but it doesn't get presented to them very well. And that method of looking at the situation is devaluated by experienced players because of the always on competitive PvP kind of nature of Eve, right? So that's a big reason why CCP has been working so hard on the MPE, because for a long time it's been about like, well, CCP doesn't want to tell us what we're doing, right? Or why we're doing things or whatever. That it's all about our, you know, the player's experience. And for the purposes of the sandbox, that's correct. But a new player needs a path. To have a choice, you must first know what that choice is. If you tell me to do something, right now, the Galente and the Caldari have both given orders to secure Othanoon. You must go there and do everything you can to kill everybody who's in there, work with the militia, take it over. That's what you're supposed to be doing right now. 07, thank you, Evenington. Are you going to? Yes, no. That's your choice. That choice exists. If you decide to not engage in the event that happens starting next week, that's fine. No one's going to hate you for it. And the only thing you lose out is in the experience of doing it, or in like maybe the early, it's probably some ISK because it's got new stuff in it or whatever, right? Like if you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. If you want to do it, then it's there. But if CCP didn't put that event there, there would be no choice. I can't choose to work for the Caldari if the Caldari don't tell me what to do. But if they tell me what to do, I can choose to do it or work against it, or to do nothing. That is why CCP, as the E in PvE, their job is to make the universe do things. And it's our reactions to those things that are happening that spiral out into the meta narrative of conflict, etc. No, like in a meta level. Like there's no, you don't go like down like a chain that you're required to, like there are some, a few like arcs or whatever, but it's not like you select a class and then go through a whole story. Or, you know, like when you're doing a mission, this is what you're being told what to do and you're getting paid. But there's no like meta story as to why you're doing missions, if that makes sense. So, yeah, it's like a D&D campaign with CCP playing as a dungeon master. So that's the problem. So we need things to be happening. Even if you're not into faction warfare, all of this stuff happening will lead to things. It'll lead to people going and taking part. It'll lead to new items coming out. It'll lead to an opportunity to go down there and kill everybody who's in that one constellation trying to do stuff. It'll be an opportunity to talk about it for hours on end on podcasts and such. Yeah, emergent gameplay is the best part of EVE, but emergent gameplay comes from catalysts, right? It comes, emergent gameplay emerges from somewhere. Well, I might be in my own little echo chamber at this point, but it looks like a lot of people agree with me.
When you log into any MMO, ask yourself, why are you playing? Do you enjoy the process itself, or is the process simply a means to an end? Do you want to be objectively better and more powerful than others, or do you want to be as powerful in a different way? Do you want to be part of the race, constantly pushing forward into the more powerful, more difficult content, or are you content to go and do the older stuff because it still has meaning to you and isn't yet outdated? Are you a vertical progress player or a horizontal experience player? Let me know.
So this actually leads to a couple of problems too. Like for instance, that last line, right? Do you do old content because it's still relevant? So old content that is still relevant is going to have a desire to be done. Here we get things like incursions, right? Like incursions is undoubtedly old content, but it's still relevant. But it's only relevant because of its ISK, which means no one's interested in the experience. Even somebody who's like coming in, your job is to learn what's going on and do it correctly. It's not about being creative. It's not about, you know, whatever. It's about knowing what's supposed to happen and doing it as quickly and efficiently as possible to make the most ISK as possible, because it's 10-year-old content. It's just forced to remain relevant just because its rewards are so much higher than some other options. So, and what if you're in a descending spiral? Reach out, get help. ISK matters because we lose ships to not afford to replace them anymore. Yes, absolutely. But the thing is that leads me to another thing that I like to remind people about, which is that we focus so much on the ISK generation side of the house when it comes to how to deal with this problem. But it is far more effective to deal with it on the output side of things. In other words, if you learn faction warfare flying around in 5 million ISK ships, then you will need to earn way less ISK than if you fly around in 80 million ISK worms. Now, will you win as many fights? Probably not. Will you get as much experience? Maybe, maybe not. But you can limit, or another example is like, if you can pay, I can pay 2 billion ISK to make 2 million more tick or whatever, right? Like, I'm just saying that often I find that people become obsessed with maximizing their ISK per hour and not minimizing the cost it takes for them to get it. Does that make sense? This is why I say it's better to learn with cheap stuff on low tier, because you can learn the same lesson in a Hawk in a tier 5 or a Kestrel in a tier 1. Do you want to pay 5 million for that lesson, or do you want to pay 70 million for that lesson? Because it's coming. You got to learn it one way or another. Is this to determine if Eve is horizontal? Well, this is we're looking at Eve from the concept of horizontal versus vertical design. As he even said, like, most horizontal design systems can actually have verticality in it. So the answer is that Eve Online is a horizontal system with some verticality. However, the metagame that we have built on top of Eve is absolutely a vertical design. You do not work to gain additional options necessarily within the metagame. You work to gain additional power within the metagame. As an alliance, that is what you do. Now, there are some examples of like, oh, we're going to work together to build our Titan so that way we have the ability to bridge. But for the most part, on an alliance level, we're playing a vertical game. And on a horizontal level, on an individual level, especially the newer you go, it's designed as a horizontal game. And the problem is that means that sets up bad expectations for the people that are evaluating it as a vertical game. And it's making a lot of the actual work and value of the game as a horizontal game not actually come to fruition, because it's not seen as valuable to do. Right? I think that's it.
No, in the comments below. Another massive thank you to Guild Wars 2 for sponsoring this video.
And another massive thank you to Josh Hayes for putting up this video and letting me comment to it. No, it's actually really funny. I'll close this out by saying that this morning, I've been wanting to react to this video for like the last week, or since he came out with it. But I was kind of nervous. Like, he actually made he had a whole arc about reaction videos and how the reaction meta is just about like playing the video while staring at it, and what constitutes good reaction. So I was kind of angsty about it. But then today I tweeted because I wanted to be able to say, like, at least I said something about it. So I tweeted, like, I'm going to be reviewing Josh Hayes' blah, blah, blah in how it relates to EVE Online. And the dude liked my tweet. So at that point, there was no backing out. So with that said, I appreciate you guys for hanging out and taking part. I thought it was an interesting discussion. If you have any thoughts about it, you can go ahead and put them in the comments below on YouTube. But until next time, I do want to thank my sponsors and supporters, the people who sub on Twitch and watch my stuff and my videos and share those videos around, because we want to increase overall EVE literacy. So you can always share around my playlist about EVE Online, like the guides, like my 6 hours of every single module in the game, basically. Let's help each other. Let's help raise Eve literacy together. But I also especially want to thank Kuhn, Abyssus, Jenny, Elange, Fatewinder, Kotoba Manac, Fayssal, Seedsaplenty, Divoolej, Lares Hane, Gragnor, YellowCladKing, Zaul Nex, BlackRoseNoble, Dajat Lemmont, MidnightSpaceMonkey, NotJustFun, Serenalen with no eyes, Syliana Vel'ash, Talking in Stations, Nephilim, and Grendel, as well as my Immortal tier patron, Divoolej. Thank you all. And until next time, I've been Ashrathi, the voice of New Eden, and I'll see you in space. Oh, I forgot one of my points. I forgot one of the big points. I might try to edit this in. But like one of the big points. So, okay. So let's think about what exacerbates. There's a big thing that I think it makes that vertical progression problem more serious for EVE Online, right? Why we have this emergent behavior of vertical design, even though the game is mostly horizontal. Well, first of all, there's the obvious solution, which is the death is a serious matter. When that is true, you know, there's a survival instinct that kicks in. And so being able to gain the ability to overpower that feeling is a big part of that, right? That it naturally sets it up. But I think that EVE actually does one thing in particular with its design that really, really makes this problem worse. And that is capital design. Yay, I brought it back to that's all supers. The problem here is that capitals have carriers, supercarriers, dreadnoughts, and titans. In essence, supers are more or less better carriers, and in Faxes, sorry, and dreads scale up to titans pretty well, as like titans are stronger dreads. And Faxes are the healers. So you have damage dealers with fighters, and the Repper. Technically, you could say that the supers have their E-War bursts and stuff like that. But the bottom line is, we go from we go from this to this. This is why we have a verticality problem. Because all of the complexity, all of the different options and different stuff that they put in here, this crushes them all. Or like this, by crushes, I mean like collapses all of the options down to only a handful at the top level. And since that's the top level, it's like, congratulations, you played this horizontal game all this time, and then when you hit capitals, there's such a jump that it suddenly becomes a vertical game. I think that the lack of detail and complexity in the upper bounds of EVE's design makes this problem so much worse. Because the problem isn't that everybody wants a Titan. It's that it's a Titan. There's no, it's not like we're arguing about like a logistics ship versus a hack versus a, whatever else. What I'm saying is that like these things are such a scale of their own that the other things don't necessarily stand as much of a consideration, especially in the most important things, quote unquote. Jita, I am actually more talking. I am actually more talking about it before the scarcity and the capital nerfs and all that stuff. This was the big problem then, and they've reined it in a little bit now. But ultimately, this is why it's difficult for them to rein it in, right? Because you step up to capitals, it's now capital world. It's very difficult, except for like the lowest tier capitals, for these things. Oops, wrong screen. It's very difficult for these subcapitals to have that much impact in the capital world, especially by the time you get to super capitals. Especially at super capitals, everything is, by the time you get to super capitals, you've collapsed everything into titans and super carriers. And that's just not, it smashes a lot of the nuance. So you can dock capitals and you can dock supers in keep stars, which are like the biggest player stations. So this is where a lot of that stuff about like, well, subcapitals need to be able to affect capitals. A lot of that kind of angst, the powering up of battleships to try to bring them closer in line with capitals. All those things kind of play into this fact that we have all of this complexity in EVE combat, but really all of it is a sham because the important fights involve 8 ships and maybe whole fleets of other stuff. Awesome, James. Next Tuesday is going to be fun. So yeah, I think that that's a big thing to kind of extract from this discussion. Because it is vertical in that sense. It has an end game in that sense. And so you can't blame the people that use these tools in their major struggle, i.e. sovereignty, to look at it that way. Hold on. There's a lot of cool stuff involved in capitals. There's a lot of nuance here and there. There's important decisions that must be made. A lot of those important decisions happen on a meta level. In other words, it's like fleet level decisions. But this goes back to what Hilmar was saying about how Titans are really simple to play while frigates are really complex to play, and how that's backwards, right? Well, there is a world arc, but the world arc isn't something that players can have. You think that I'm 80% wrong? I am open to discussing such things. I like discussing it. I'm not sure if I'd go with 80% wrong, but maybe. I'm just looking at what's there and trying to be like, what does what the video talked about, if we evaluate what's been going on in EVE and what has gone in EVE and what happens in EVE, how do those two things what can we take from it? And so by asking ourselves, like, the people that look at things from a capital perspective rightfully look at it as a vertical problem. At least, especially before scarcity. There are faction titans. That's true. CCP really has not, like, the entire faction capital meta has developed almost independent of CCP, which is really cool. And I think that there's like totally a place for that. I'm not even saying that this is a bad thing. I'm not saying that capitals need to be changed. But if we're aware of what the effect is, we can look into other things. It might bring us to novel solutions, or just circumvent the problem altogether, right? If this is a high-end choice issue, then giving people different kinds of high-end objectives might be the thing. If this is a choice at high scale level, maybe there should be different kinds of capitals that have other kinds of really powerful ability, or useful abilities. So that way there's different kinds of things that happen. You get what I'm saying? Like, understanding the problem this way, or at least looking at the problem this way, might allow us to gain different kinds of insight. Not that it's 100% correct. I guess I should also put in that disclaimer that I'm not that much of a nullsec guy. So if somebody like Redline says differently about how things go, I would trust him over me. Mining Titan win. Valamir, I'm gonna give you like 20 seconds to figure it out. I have faith in you. It's a rock wall.